Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we dive beneath the waves, into the realm of one of the most powerful and temperamental gods of ancient Greece, a god whose domain stretched across every ocean, every sea, every trembling fault line beneath the earth, a god who created horses with a strike of his trident and who pursued vengeance across a decade of storms. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin our journey into the world of Poseidon, the earth shaker, lord of the deep. There is something primal about the sea. The ancients knew this better than most. They watched the tides rise and fall with the moon's passage. They saw ships swallowed whole by storms that appeared from nowhere. They felt the earth shake beneath their feet and watched coastal cities crumble into the waves. And they understood that such forces could not be random. There had to be a will behind them, a consciousness, a god. That god was Poseidon. His name echoes through Greek mythology like the crash of waves against stone. In the oldest records we have, written in Linear B script on clay tablets from Mycenaean Greece over 3,000 years ago, his name appears alongside Zeus and other gods, evidence that he was already deeply important to Greek religion in its earliest forms. He was not merely important, he was essential. The sea was life itself to the Greeks. It connected their scattered islands and colonies. It provided fish to feed their people. It carried their merchants and their warriors. To anger the god of the sea was to invite disaster. But Poseidon was more than just a sea god. His dominion extended far beyond the salt waters. He was the earth shaker, the one who could split mountains and topple cities with earthquakes. He was the creator and tamer of horses, those magnificent creatures that represented speed, power, and freedom. He was a king among the Olympians, second in power only to his brother Zeus, and he never let anyone forget it. The Greeks depicted him as a mature, powerfully built figure with dark hair and a thick beard, often with a stormy expression that matched his temperament. In one hand, he carried his signature weapon, the three-pronged trident, capable of stirring the seas into fury or calming them to glass. Sometimes he rode a chariot pulled by hippocamps, creatures that were horse in front and fish behind, bridging his two great domains. Other times he was shown with dolphins playing in the waves around him, or bulls, symbols of his raw power and occasionally violent nature. He was not a god you prayed to lightly. Poseidon was known for his volatile moods, swinging from benevolence to rage with the unpredictability of the sea itself. Sailors offered him sacrifices before every voyage, hoping for calm waters and favorable winds. Coastal cities built temples in his honor, grand structures perched on cliffs overlooking the waves where priests made offerings and sought his protection. Horse breeders invoked his name. Those who survived earthquakes gave thanks that his wrath had passed. To understand Poseidon is to understand the ancient Greek relationship with forces beyond human control. He embodied everything that made life both possible and perilous. He could grant safe passage or send ships to the bottom of the sea. He could provide fresh water springs with a strike of his trident or curse the land with drought. He could bless a hero or pursue him across the known world with relentless vengeance. This is the story of that god, of how he came to rule the seas, of his struggles for power and recognition, of his children, both divine and monstrous, of his temples and the games held in his honor, of the heroes he helped and those he destroyed. This is the story of Poseidon, and it begins, as so many Greek myths do, with violence and betrayal. Poseidon's story begins in darkness, not the darkness of the deep ocean that would one day be his kingdom, but the darkness of his father's stomach. He was born to Cronus and Rhea, the king and queen of the Titans, that older generation of gods who ruled before the Olympians. Cronus had seized power from his own father Uranus, castrating him with a sickle forged by the earth herself. But with that violent act came a curse. Uranus warned Cronus that he too would be overthrown by his own children. Cronus, paranoid and desperate to maintain his grip on power, found a simple if horrifying solution. Each time Rhea bore a child, he took the newborn and swallowed it whole. Not dead, but imprisoned in the darkness of his belly, suspended in time, unable to grow or threaten his rule. Poseidon was the second son swallowed by Cronus, after his older brother Hades. His sisters Hestia, Demeter, and Hera had already suffered the same fate. In some versions of the myth, Rhea tried to save Poseidon by hiding him among a flock of lambs in Arcadia, or sending him to be raised by the Telchines on the island of Rhodes. But most traditions hold that he shared the fate of his siblings, trapped in that terrible prison, waiting. Everything changed when the youngest child was born. Rhea, grief-stricken and furious at the loss of her children, finally rebelled. When Zeus was born, she hid him on the island of Crete, giving Cronus a stone wrapped in swaddling clothes instead. The Titan king, in his paranoia and haste, swallowed it without noticing the deception. Zeus grew to adulthood in secret, raised by nymphs in a cave on Mount Ida. When he was strong enough, he returned to confront his father. With the help of the Oceanid Metis, he prepared a powerful emetic, a potion that forced Cronus to vomit up everything he had swallowed. Out came the stone first, then the children, in reverse order from how they had been consumed. Poseidon emerged from his father's body fully grown. Though he had been the second swallowed, he was now the second youngest, an unusual position that perhaps shaped his later relationships with his siblings. He had been trapped in darkness while Zeus lived free. He had suffered while his youngest brother plotted and prepared. This may have planted the first seeds of the resentment that would occasionally flare between them. But there was no time for such thoughts. Cronus would not relinquish his throne without a fight, and the other Titans rallied to his cause. The Titanomachy began, a war that would rage for 10 years and reshape the cosmos. The young gods made their base on Mount Olympus, a peak that rose high enough to challenge the heavens. They faced overwhelming odds. The Titans were powerful, ancient, and experienced in battle. But Zeus had a plan. He descended into the deepest pit of the underworld, Tartarus, where their grandfather Uranus had once imprisoned the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires, the 100-handed giants. These beings had been held in chains for countless ages, first by Uranus, then by Cronus. Zeus freed them, and in gratitude they forged weapons for the young gods. For Zeus they created the thunderbolt, a weapon of pure destructive power. For Hades they made a helm of darkness that rendered its wearer invisible. And for Poseidon they forged a trident, a 3-pronged spear that would become his signature weapon and symbol. The trident was no ordinary weapon. With it, Poseidon could command the seas, raising storms or calming waters with a gesture. He could strike the earth and cause earthquakes, splitting mountains and opening chasms. He could strike rocks and bring forth springs of water. The 3 prongs may have represented his dominion over the 3 bodies of water known to the Greeks, the Mediterranean Sea, the rivers, and the springs. Or perhaps they symbolized his 3 great powers, over the sea, over earthquakes, and over horses, and over. With these divine weapons and the might of the 100-handed giants, who could hurl mountains like stones, the tide of war turned. The Olympians pressed their advantage. In the final battles, Poseidon used his new trident to devastating effect, shattering Titan strongholds and shaking the very foundations of the world. The seas themselves became weapons in his hands, flooding valleys and drowning armies. The Titans fell. Cronus, the once mighty king, was defeated by his own children. Rather than kill their father and his brothers, the Olympians chose a different punishment. They cast the Titans into Tartarus, that same dark pit from which Zeus had freed the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires. There they would remain, bound in adamantine chains, sealed behind bronze gates, guarded by the 100-handed giants to ensure they could never escape. With the war won, the question became, who would rule what? The cosmos was vast, and 3 brothers now stood victorious, Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon. They could have fought among themselves, beginning a new war before the old one had fully ended. Instead, they decided to settle the matter by lot, leaving the division to fate itself. They drew lots, and the world was divided into 3 great realms. Zeus received the sky, the air, the weather, and the right to rule as king of the gods from his throne atop Mount Olympus. Hades received the underworld, the shadowy realm of the dead beneath the earth, a kingdom wealthy in gems and precious metals, but forever cut off from the light of the sun. And Poseidon received the seas, all the waters that surrounded and flowed through the earth, a realm as vast and powerful as Zeus's sky. The earth itself, the solid ground where mortals would one day walk, was declared common territory belonging to all 3 brothers equally. This would later prove to be a source of conflict, as Poseidon often sought to extend his influence onto the land, competing with other gods for control of cities and territories. Poseidon accepted his lot, but not without reservations. The sea was a magnificent domain, powerful and essential, but he had not become king of the gods. That title went to Zeus, the youngest, the one who had never been swallowed, who had led the rebellion and now claimed the highest throne. Poseidon was second in power, and for a god of his temperament, second place would never quite feel like enough. Still, he set about making the sea his own. He built magnificent palaces beneath the waves, structures of coral and pearl, decorated with treasures from 1,000 shipwrecks. His palace near Aegae in Euboea was said to be particularly splendid, with stables for his white horses, who could gallop across the surface of the water as easily as across dry land. From these underwater halls, Poseidon would rule his realm, and woe to any mortal who forgot his power. The Earthshaker had claimed his throne. The age of the Olympians had begun, and Poseidon, god of the sea, was ready to make his mark upon the world. The sea was Poseidon's kingdom, and he ruled it absolutely. Every wave, every current, every creature that swam in the depths answered to him. The Greeks, whose entire civilization depended on maritime trade and travel, understood that the sea was not merely water. It was alive with divine presence, capricious and powerful, capable of both nurturing and destroying. Poseidon's domain stretched from the Aegean Sea, where Greek ships plied their trade, to the vast Mediterranean that connected Greece with Egypt, Phoenicia and Italy, to the mysterious waters beyond the Pillars of Heracles, where few dared venture. He commanded not just the salt seas, but also the rivers that flowed through the land, the springs that bubbled up from the earth, and even the fresh water trapped in underground reservoirs. Water in all its forms was his to control. His underwater palace was the stuff of legend. Ancient writers described it as built from gold and jewels, gleaming even in the dark depths, visible from the surface on clear days when the sea was calm. Coral formed its columns, pearls studded its walls, and sea flowers grew in its gardens. It was a place of impossible beauty, where dolphins played in the corridors and hippocamps grazed in meadows of kelp. Tritons, the mermen who served as Poseidon's heralds and messengers, swam through its halls, and Nereids, the 50 beautiful daughters of the sea god Nereus, danced in its courts. But Poseidon could not rule such a realm alone. Like his brothers, he needed a consort, a queen to share his throne. His choice fell upon Amphitrite, one of the Nereids, a sea goddess of exceptional beauty, who embodied the calm, nurturing aspects of the ocean. She was the eldest daughter of Nereus and Doris, which made her sea royalty in her own right, a fitting match for the lord of all waters. The courtship, however, did not go smoothly. When Poseidon first approached Amphitrite with his suit, she was not interested. Perhaps she had heard tales of his volatile temper. Perhaps she valued her freedom too highly to become the wife of so powerful and demanding a god. Whatever her reasons, she refused him and fled, hiding herself in the Atlas Mountains far from the sea. Poseidon was not accustomed to rejection, but he was determined. He sent messengers across the world to find her, promising rewards to whoever could convince her to return. It was Delphinus, a dolphin, who finally succeeded. With sweet words and persuasive arguments, Delphinus won Amphitrite over, convincing her that Poseidon's love was genuine and that she would be honored as queen of the seas. In gratitude, Poseidon later placed Delphinus among the stars as the constellation Delphinus, ensuring that the dolphin would be remembered forever. Amphitrite returned to the sea and married Poseidon. Their wedding was celebrated throughout the oceans, with sea creatures of every kind gathering to witness the union. Together they had children who would become gods and goddesses in their own right. Their son Triton became the herald of the sea, a merman who carried a conch shell that he could blow to calm or raise the waves. When he blew his horn, the seas obeyed, and sailors took it as a sign of Poseidon's will. They also had 2 daughters. Rhode gave her name to the island of Rhodes and became its patron goddess, later marrying Helios, the sun god, and bearing him 7 sons. Benthesisime was a goddess of the waves, who married an Ethiopian king, and became known for her kindness in raising orphaned children of the sea. Some traditions mention a 3rd daughter, Kimopolea, goddess of violent storm waves, who married one of the 100-handed giants who had helped win the war against the Titans. Despite this apparently stable family life, Poseidon, like his brother Zeus, was not known for his fidelity. He had numerous affairs with goddesses, nymphs, and mortal women, producing a vast array of offspring that ranged from noble heroes to terrifying monsters. Amphitrite, understandably, was not always pleased with these indiscretions. In one notable case, when Poseidon took up with the beautiful nymph Scylla, Amphitrite's jealousy drove her to cast magical herbs into the girl's bathing pool. The herbs transformed Scylla into a hideous monster, with 6 dog heads and 12 feet, who would haunt the Straits of Messina and devour sailors who passed too close to her rocky lair. But these affairs and family dramas were secondary to Poseidon's primary role, master of the sea and protector of sailors. Seafarers offered prayers and sacrifices to him before every voyage, asking for calm waters and favorable winds. They poured libations of wine into the waves and threw offerings overboard, hoping to win his favor. Even pirates and raiders invoked his name, though whether Poseidon cared about the moral character of those who sought his aid is questionable. The trident was Poseidon's primary symbol and weapon. With it, he could do far more than simply stir up storms. He could split rocks to create fresh water springs, providing life-giving water to coastal communities. He could shake the earth, causing earthquakes that toppled cities. He could calm raging seas with a gesture, granting safe passage to those he favored. The trident's 3 prongs made it instantly recognizable, appearing on coins, in sculptures, and in paintings throughout the ancient Greek world. Poseidon's power over storms was legendary. When he was angry, he could whip the seas into a frenzy, sending waves high as mountains to smash ships to splinters. Lightning might flash from his trident. Rain would pour down in sheets. The wind would howl like a living thing. Sailors caught in such storms knew they had somehow offended the god, and they would pray desperately for forgiveness, promising greater sacrifices if only he would spare them. But Poseidon could also be merciful. When approached with proper respect and appropriate offerings, he was known as Soter, the savior, who protected mariners from danger. He could send dolphins to guide lost ships to harbor. He could calm storms that had been raised by other causes. He could ensure that fish filled the nets of those who honored him. Fishing communities held festivals in his name, celebrating the bounty he provided. His control extended to every creature of the sea. Dolphins were considered sacred to him, both for the service Delphinus had rendered in winning Amphitrite, and because dolphins were known to rescue drowning sailors, guiding them to shore. To kill a dolphin was to invite Poseidon's wrath. Fish of all kinds answered to his will, from the smallest minnow to the great whales that breached in the deep waters. Sea monsters and serpents, the feared krakens and leviathans of sailors' tales, were often described as servants of Poseidon, released by him to punish those who had angered him. The ancient Greeks believed that all bodies of water were connected, flowing into and out of each other in a great cycle. The sea surrounded the earth, and rivers flowed from the sea through the land and back to the sea again. Springs bubbled up from the sea beneath the ground. This interconnected view made Poseidon's realm even more comprehensive. He was not confined to the ocean. He was present wherever water flowed or pooled or surged. This belief had practical implications. When earthquakes struck, the Greeks noted that they often occurred near water or were accompanied by changes in water levels. Rivers might suddenly dry up or flood. Wells might fail or suddenly produce abundant water. The ground might open up to reveal underground streams. All of this confirmed their understanding that Poseidon held the earth in his embrace, and when he moved, the earth moved with him. Poseidon's marine court reflected the diversity of the sea itself. Nereus, the old man of the sea, lived in his underwater palace and was known for his wisdom and his ability to change shape. His 50 Nereid daughters, including Amphitrite, were goddesses of the sea's many moods and aspects. Proteus, another sea god with shape-shifting powers, herded seals and possessed prophetic knowledge. Glaucus, once a mortal fisherman, had become a sea god after eating a magical herb. These and countless other marine deities acknowledged Poseidon as their overlord. The sea could be serene or savage, nurturing or deadly, and Poseidon embodied all of these qualities. He was praised in hymns as Lord of the Sea and dark-haired god and encircler of the earth. He was invoked as Pelagios, of the sea, and Pontios, of the deep. He was the god whose favor made the difference between a profitable voyage and a watery grave. For the Greeks, who saw the sea every day from their homes on islands and peninsulas, who depended on it for food and trade and communication, Poseidon was not some distant deity to be honored at festivals and forgotten. He was present in every wave, in every storm, in every catch of fish. He was as real as the salt spray on their faces and as dangerous as the rocks that lurked beneath the surface. He was the lord of the depths, and his kingdom was everywhere the water touched. Poseidon's dominion extended beyond the visible waters. Beneath the earth, in the dark places where no human eye could see, his power was perhaps even more terrifying. The Greeks knew him by epithets that spoke to this hidden aspect of his nature. Enosigthon, the earth shaker; Enosigios, the earth trembler; Gaiochos, the earth holder. These were not merely poetic names. They reflected a real and justified fear. Earthquakes were common in the Greek world. The Mediterranean sits along several major fault lines, and tremors both large and small were regular occurrences. Sometimes they were minor, barely noticeable rattles that made oil lamps swing and pottery clink. Other times they were catastrophic, toppling buildings, opening great cracks in the earth, destroying entire cities. The ancient Greeks, lacking our modern understanding of plate tectonics, saw divine will in these disasters, and the god they blamed was Poseidon's. The connection between Poseidon and earthquakes was not arbitrary. Ancient Greek natural philosophers, those early scientists who tried to understand the world through observation and reason, believed that water was the primary cause of earthquakes. They had noticed that earthquakes often occurred near the sea or rivers. They had seen how water could erode rock over time, creating caves and channels beneath the surface. They theorized that rivers disappeared into the earth and flowed through vast underground caverns, gradually wearing away the rock. When these caverns collapsed, the earth above them would shake and fall. This understanding naturally linked earthquakes to Poseidon, the god of all waters. If underground rivers caused the earth to shake, then Poseidon, who controlled all waters, must be the one causing the shaking. The philosopher Thales of Miletus, one of the earliest Greek thinkers, believed that the earth floated on water like a disk in an infinite ocean. When the water beneath moved, the earth moved with it. Later, philosophers like Anaximenes and even Aristotle advanced similar theories, always connecting water and earthquakes. But for most Greeks, the explanation was simpler and more direct. Poseidon held the earth in his embrace the way the sea surrounds the land. When he struck his trident against the ocean floor, the vibrations traveled through the earth, shaking it violently. When he was angry, he could make the earth buck and heave like a wild horse. Mountains could split, valleys could open, cities could fall into ruins. The archaeological record confirms how devastating these earthquakes could be. Mycenaean palaces from the Bronze Age show evidence of destruction by earthquake. The city of Helike in Achaea, which housed one of the most important temples of Poseidon, Heliconios, was completely destroyed by an earthquake and tsunami in 373 BCE, vanishing beneath the waves. The ancient writer Pausanias reported that the city sank into the earth and sea after the people of Helike had mistreated some visiting Ionian envoys. Poseidon's vengeance, the Greeks said, was complete and terrible. Yet Poseidon's role as earthshaker was not purely destructive. He was also worshipped as Asphalios, the stabilizer, the one who kept the earth secure. This paradox made sense to the Greeks. The same god who could cause earthquakes could also prevent them. By honoring Poseidon properly, by making the right sacrifices and showing proper respect, cities hoped to avoid his wrath and keep the earth still beneath their feet. Many of Poseidon's inland temples and sanctuaries were specifically dedicated to this aspect of his power. The temple at Onchestos in Boeotia, mentioned by Homer in the catalogue of ships, honored Poseidon Heliconios and was the meeting place of the Boeotian League. The temple at Helike in Achaea, before it was destroyed, served as the meeting place of the Achaean League. These inland locations, far from the sea, might seem odd places to worship a sea god until we remember his role as earth-shaker and earth-holder. In Arcadia, that mountainous region in the heart of the Peloponnese, Poseidon was worshipped in particularly ancient ways that may have predated his association with the sea. Here he was closely connected to Demeter, the grain goddess, and to horses, suggesting that his original identity may have been as a god of fresh water, fertility, and horses, only later evolving into the great sea god we know from classical mythology. The worship of Poseidon as Earthshaker involved specific rituals designed to appease him and prevent disasters. Sacrifices of bulls, those powerful animals that could represent both his strength and his sometimes violent nature, were common. Black bulls were particularly favored, perhaps because of Poseidon's connection to the dark waters of the deep and the dark earth beneath the surface. The blood of these animals was poured onto the ground, feeding the earth and the god who held it. In Sparta, there was a racecourse called the Gaiachoi, named for Poseidon's role as earth-holder, and games were held there in his honor. The temple of Poseidon Gaiachos stood beside a hippodrome, combining his roles as master of both earthquakes and horses. This integration of different aspects of the god's nature was typical of Greek religion, where deities could embody multiple, sometimes seemingly contradictory domains. Stories of Poseidon using his earthquake power circulated throughout Greece. He had used it during the war against the Titans, shaking the foundations of their mountain strongholds. He was said to have struck the island of Delos with his trident to anchor it to the sea floor, stopping it from drifting so that it could become a suitable birthplace for Apollo and Artemis. When Odysseus blinded Polyphemus, Poseidon's rage shook the seas and would have shaken the earth if Zeus had not restrained him. The unpredictability of earthquakes matched Poseidon's temperament perfectly. Just as his moods could shift from calm to stormy in an instant, so too could the earth go from stable to shaking without warning. There was no way to predict when Poseidon's anger might strike. A city could be faithful in its worship, performing all the proper rituals, and still suffer an earthquake. A region could ignore him and somehow escape unscathed. This randomness only increased the fear and respect the Greeks felt toward him. When earthquakes did strike, they were interpreted as signs of Poseidon's displeasure. Priests would analyze what might have caused the offense. Had someone insulted the god? Had proper sacrifices been neglected? Was there pollution in the city that needed to be cleansed? Additional offerings would be made, prayers spoken, festivals declared. Sometimes the reasons given seemed specific, like Helice's mistreatment of the Ionian visitors. Other times the cause remained mysterious, known only to the god himself. The Greeks understood that they lived in a fundamentally unstable world. The earth beneath their feet, which should have been the very symbol of stability and permanence, could betray them without warning. The seas they depended upon could turn deadly in moments. Both were under the control of one god, and that god was known for his fierce temper and his long memory for slights. Is it any wonder they took his worship seriously? Poseidon's role as Earthshaker reminds us that Greek religion was not just about explaining the world, but about negotiating with forces beyond human control. Every prayer, every sacrifice, every temple built was an attempt to maintain proper relations with the gods, to stay on their good side, to avoid their wrath. And no god's wrath was more sudden, more violent, or more devastating than Poseidon's, when his anger made the earth itself convulse. So of all Poseidon's domains, perhaps the most surprising is his deep connection to horses. Here was a god of the sea, of deep waters and crashing waves, and yet the Greeks insisted he was also the creator and patron of horses, those magnificent land animals. This association puzzled even ancient scholars, but it was deeply embedded in Greek culture and worship, and the myths provide several explanations for how the Lord of Waters became the tamer of horses. The connection may be ancient beyond even Greek memory. In Linear B texts from Mycenaean Greece, Poseidon's name appears with frequency, and he seems to have been associated with horses from the earliest times. In the isolated region of Arcadia, where some of Greece's oldest religious practices persisted, Poseidon was worshipped primarily as a horse god rather than a sea god. There he was depicted with the head of a horse and was closely connected to Demeter, the grain goddess, in myths that spoke of fertility and the land. One myth tells of Poseidon pursuing Demeter while she was searching for her abducted daughter Persephone. To escape his advances, Demeter transformed herself into a mare and hid among a herd of horses, but Poseidon was not fooled. He transformed into a stallion and caught her, and from their union came two offspring, a daughter whose name was spoken only in mysteries and never revealed to outsiders, and a magnificent horse named Arion, who could speak with human voice and ran faster than the wind. Arion became one of the most famous horses in Greek mythology. He was eventually owned by the hero Heracles and later by King Adrastus of Argos, who rode him in the war of the Seven against Thebes. Arion's speed saved Adrastus's life when the war went disastrously wrong, allowing him to escape when all his companions perished. The horse with dark mane and immortal lineage became a symbol of Poseidon's power extending onto the land. Another famous myth tells of how Poseidon created the first horse. In this version, the gods were competing to offer gifts to humanity, each trying to demonstrate their value and secure worship. Poseidon struck a rock with his trident, and from that spot sprang the first horse, fully formed and magnificent. Some versions say this happened on the Acropolis in Athens during his contest with Athena for patronage of that city. Others place it in Thessaly, a region famous for its horses and horsemanship. Still others say it occurred in various locations, because Poseidon created horses multiple times, perfecting them with each attempt. The ancient writer Pausanias recorded local traditions that the first horse Poseidon created was actually somewhat imperfect, and only later attempts produced the noble animal we recognize. This may have been a way to explain why Poseidon tried multiple times in different locations, each leaving its own tradition and claimed to being the birthplace of horses. The connection between horses and water, between Poseidon's two great domains, was not as strange as it might first appear. Horses were essential for travel and trade, connecting distant parts of Greece just as ships connected islands across the sea. Both represented movement, speed, and a certain wildness that had to be tamed through skill and courage. The Greeks even saw physical similarities. Horses' flowing manes resembled waves. Their speed across land matched ships' speed across water. The foam that appeared around a galloping horse's mouth looked like sea foam. More practically, horses needed water to survive, and good pasture land required rivers and springs. In a region like Greece, where fresh water was precious, the god who controlled that water would naturally be connected to the animals who depended on it. Poseidon, as provider of springs and rivers, was essential to horse breeding. The most famous of all equine offspring attributed to Poseidon was Pegasus, the winged horse. Pegasus was born in an unusual way. When the hero Perseus beheaded the Gorgon Medusa, from her severed neck sprang two beings, Chrysaor, a warrior with a golden sword, and Pegasus, the magnificent white horse with wings. Both were children of Poseidon, conceived when the sea god had lain with Medusa, back when she was still a beautiful maiden, before Athena transformed her into a monster as punishment for that union occurring in Athena's temple. Pegasus embodied the connection between sea and sky that Poseidon sometimes claimed. The winged horse could fly through the air like a bird, but was born from the sea god's power. He became the mount of the hero Bellerophon, who tamed him with the help of a golden bridle given by Athena. Together, Bellerophon and Pegasus accomplished great deeds, including slaying the Chimera, a fire-breathing monster that had terrorized the land of Lycia. But Bellerophon's story ended tragically, as so many Greek hero tales did. Filled with pride at his accomplishments, he attempted to ride Pegasus up to Mount Olympus itself to take his place among the gods. Zeus, angered by this presumption, sent a gadfly to sting Pegasus. The horse bucked and Bellerophon fell to earth, spending the rest of his life wandering alone and crippled. Pegasus, however, continued to Olympus, where Zeus employed him to carry thunderbolts. Eventually, the winged horse was placed among the stars as the constellation that bears his name. Poseidon's association with horses made him the patron god of horse racing and equestrian competitions. The Isthmian Games, one of the four major pan-Hellenic festivals, were held in Poseidon's honor and featured prominent horse and chariot races. The Olympic Games, though primarily dedicated to Zeus, also included equestrian events where competitors prayed to Poseidon for victory. Wealthy aristocrats who could afford to breed and race horses often made lavish sacrifices to Poseidon, asking him to bless their stables and grant speed to their animals. In Thessaly, a region renowned throughout Greece for its cavalry and horse breeding, Poseidon was particularly revered. The Thessalian plain was perfect grazing land for horses, watered by rivers that flowed down from the surrounding mountains. The Thessalians attributed their equestrian excellence to Poseidon's favor. They held festivals in his honor, and their cavalry units invoked his name before battle. Poseidon was given the epithet Hippios, of horses, and temples dedicated to Poseidon Hippios could be found throughout Greece. At Colonus near Athens, there was a sanctuary where both Poseidon and Athena were worshipped together as patrons of horses and horsemanship. In Arcadia, ancient groves and springs sacred to Poseidon were places where horses were brought to be blessed and where horse breeders made offerings. The practical importance of horses in Greek society cannot be overstated. They were essential for agriculture, pulling plows through fields. They were vital for warfare, carrying cavalry into battle or pulling chariots. They were status symbols, expensive animals that only the wealthy could afford to maintain. They were used in religious festivals and processions, adding grandeur and solemnity to important occasions. A god who blessed horses blessed the entire economy and military might of a city. But horses were also seen as somewhat wild and unpredictable animals, difficult to tame, potentially dangerous. A horse could be loyal and obedient one moment, then throw its rider the next. This temperament matched Poseidon's own nature perfectly. He could be calm and benevolent, granting safe passage and rich catches of fish. But cross him, and his fury would descend without warning or mercy. Like the horses he created, Poseidon had to be approached with a mixture of confidence and caution, respect and skill. The image of Poseidon riding across the waves in a chariot, pulled by horses or by hippocamps, those hybrid creatures that were horse in front and fish behind, was common in Greek art. It symbolized his mastery over both his primary domain, the sea, and his secondary but still vital connection to horses. The chariot itself was another link between sea and land, a vehicle that could metaphorically cross both terrains. Some scholars have suggested that Poseidon's horse association may actually predate his connection to the sea. In the earliest Greek religion, before the great maritime expansion that made sea trade so important, Poseidon may have been primarily a god of fresh water, earthquakes and horses. Only later, as the Greeks became more seafaring, did he assume dominion over the salt seas, eventually eclipsing his other roles in the popular imagination. But the horse connection remained, a trace of that earlier identity. Whether this theory is correct or not, the association was real and deeply meaningful to the Greeks. When they raced horses at the Isthmian Games, they were honoring Poseidon. When they bred fine stallions in Thessaly, they credited Poseidon with their success. When they saw waves crashing against the shore with white foam flying, they compared it to the manes of galloping horses and remembered that the same god ruled both. The Earthshaker, the lord of the seas, was also the creator and tamer of horses, and all three aspects of his power shaped the Greek world. For all his power, Poseidon was never content with second place. He ruled the seas absolutely, commanded earthquakes, and had created horses, but none of this satisfied his ambition. He was a king without the crown, a god whose domain was vast, but whose authority was always subordinate to Zeus. This frustration manifested in numerous conflicts and contests, as Poseidon repeatedly tried to extend his influence onto the land, competing with other gods for control of cities and territories. The most famous of these contests was his rivalry with Athena over Athens. The competition occurred in the earliest days of the city, when it was still small and unnamed, and the gods were seeking mortal worshippers to honor them. Both Poseidon and Athena desired to become the city's patron deity, and rather than fight openly, they agreed to a contest. Each would offer a gift to the city's people, and the citizens would choose which gift was more valuable. The contest took place on the Acropolis, the high rocky outcrop that dominated the landscape. Poseidon went first. He struck the rock with his trident, and a spring burst forth. Water in a dry land should have been the perfect gift, but there was a problem. The water was salt water, undrinkable and unsuitable for irrigation. Some versions of the myth say the salt spring was still accompanied by the sound of waves, bringing the presence of the sea to the hilltop. Others say that along with the spring a horse appeared, demonstrating Poseidon's creative power. Then came Athena's turn. She knelt and planted something in the earth, An olive tree grew, the first olive tree in Attica. It was a perfect gift. Olive trees provided food, oil for lamps and cooking, wood for building, and olives were valuable trade goods. The tree required little water and could thrive in the rocky Greek soil. It was useful in every way. The citizens and their king Cecrops, who was half man and half serpent, chose Athena's gift. The city would be called Athens in her honor, and she would be its patron goddess. Her temple, the Parthenon, would eventually crown the Acropolis, and her statue would stand watch over the city. Poseidon was furious at this rejection. In his rage, he flooded the Thriasian plain that surrounded Athens, covering farmland with salt water and destroying crops. The Athenians had to make additional sacrifices and dedications to appease him. Even after Athens was firmly established as Athena's city, Poseidon maintained a significant presence there. He had a temple on the Acropolis itself, the Erechtheion, where the marks of his trident were supposedly still visible in the rock, and where his sacred salt spring still flowed. This story was told and retold in Athens, and it reveals much about Greek values. The contest was decided not by might, but by utility. Poseidon offered power and grandeur, the horse and the sea's connection. Athena offered practical wisdom, something useful for daily life. The Athenians chose wisdom over power, and in doing so they defined their city's character. They saw themselves as rational, valuing intelligence and craft over brute force, but they never entirely forgot Poseidon, because to do so would be to invite his wrath. Athens was not the only city where Poseidon competed for patronage. In Argos, he contested with Hera for the honor of being the city's primary deity. The river gods of the region were chosen as judges, and they decided in favor of Hera. Poseidon's response was characteristic. He dried up all the rivers in the region, making Argos suffer from chronic water shortages. Only through Hera's intervention and continuous sacrifices to Poseidon were the rivers partially restored, though the Argolid remained one of the driest regions in Greece. In Trojan, Poseidon competed with Athena again, and this time they decided to share the city rather than fight over it. Both were honored there, and the hero Theseus, who claimed Poseidon as his divine father, made Trojan one of his important cult centers before moving to Athens. In Corinth, Poseidon's claim was challenged by Helios, the sun god. The case was judged by Briareus, one of the 100-handed giants, who awarded the Isthmus of Corinth to Poseidon and the Acrocorinth, the high citadel, to Helios. This made Corinth's location particularly important to Poseidon, and the Isthmian Games held there became one of his most important festivals. But Poseidon's conflicts were not limited to contests over cities. He had a long-standing rivalry with Apollo that manifested in several myths. Both gods had served King Laomedon of Troy, building the city's famous walls. When Laomedon refused to pay them the agreed-upon wages, both gods took revenge. Poseidon sent a sea monster to ravage the Trojan coast, while Apollo sent a plague. This betrayal by Laomedon would color Poseidon's attitude toward Troy in the later Trojan War. Perhaps the most serious conflict Poseidon engaged in was his rebellion against Zeus himself. Along with Hera and Athena, Poseidon once conspired to overthrow his brother. The three gods managed to bind Zeus in chains while he slept, but Thetis, the sea nymph, who would later become the mother of Achilles, summoned Briareus, the 100-handed giant, to free Zeus. The king of the gods, once liberated, punished the conspirators severely. Apollo and Poseidon were sent to serve King Laomedon, which led to the wall-building episode and subsequent non-payment. Hera was hung from the sky with golden chains. This rebellion was never forgotten. It demonstrated that even Poseidon, powerful as he was, could not challenge Zeus's ultimate authority. But it also showed Poseidon's deep-seated resentment at being second. He had been swallowed by their father just as Zeus had been, well, almost. He had fought in the same war. He had received a realm by lot, not by any lack of worthiness, and yet Zeus ruled while he served. Most of the time, Poseidon accepted his position. He sat on the Council of Olympus. He attended divine assemblies. He voted on matters affecting both gods and mortals. He generally supported the Olympian order against threats from giants, monsters, and other challenges. But the tension was always there, surfacing in his contests over cities, in his quick temper when shown disrespect, in his willingness to act independently rather than always seeking Zeus's approval. The Greeks understood this dynamic. They knew that power creates hierarchy, and hierarchy creates resentment. Even among gods, perhaps especially among gods, jealousy and ambition existed. The fact that Poseidon lost most of his contests over cities didn't diminish him in Greek eyes. He remained immensely powerful and worthy of worship. But these stories acknowledged that sometimes even gods don't get everything they want. And when they don't, the consequences can be disastrous for mortals caught in the middle. When Poseidon flooded the Thriasian plain or dried up the rivers of Argos, he was exercising the only real power he had in these situations, the ability to make life difficult for those who had rejected him. He couldn't force Athens to abandon Athena or Argos to abandon Hera, but he could remind them that he was not to be taken lightly, and so the cities maintained his worship alongside their primary patron deities, trying to keep the peace with a god who never entirely forgave being chosen second. These contests and conflicts reveal a fundamental truth about Greek religion. It was transactional and pragmatic. The gods had to be honored not just because they were worthy of honor, but because failure to honor them had consequences. Poseidon's jealousy was not a flaw to be overlooked, but a reality to be managed. His power over water, earthquakes, and horses meant that no city could afford to ignore him, regardless of which god they chose as their primary patron. In a world where multiple gods wielded real power, diplomacy was essential, and sacrifices were a form of insurance against divine wrath. Like his brother Zeus, Poseidon was prolific in his romantic liaisons, and from these unions came a vast array of offspring. Some were noble heroes who founded dynasties and performed great deeds. Others were monsters whose very existence brought terror to the world. The children of Poseidon embodied both the creative and destructive aspects of the sea itself, ranging from protective spirits to man-eating giants. With his wife Amphitrite, Poseidon had legitimate divine children. Triton, their son, became one of the most recognizable figures in Greek mythology. He was depicted as a merman, human from the waist up and fish from the waist down, with a powerful tail that could propel him through the water at great speeds. Triton served as his father's herald and messenger, carrying a conch-shell trumpet that he would blow to calm or raise the waves. When he blew softly, the seas would become as smooth as glass. When he blew with force, storms would rise and waves would tower. Sailors listened for Triton's horn, knowing it signaled Poseidon's will. Triton was generally benevolent toward mortals, helping guide ships and rescue drowning sailors. He had his own cult in several locations, particularly in Libya, where local legends said he lived in a lake and sometimes emerged to interact with humans. In one story, he wrestled with the hero Heracles, who had come seeking directions. After a fierce battle, the two became friends, and Triton helped Heracles on his journey. Poseidon's daughters with Amphitrite, Rhode and Benthesicyme, became minor goddesses associated with specific locations. Rhode gave her name to the island of Rhodes and married Helios, the sun god, bearing him 7 sons, who became the first people of Rhodes. Benthesicyme lived near the coast of Ethiopia and was known for her kindness, taking in the exiled children of other gods and raising them as her own. But Poseidon's most famous and consequential children came from his affairs outside of his marriage. One of the most important was Theseus, the great hero of Athens. The circumstances of Theseus's conception were unusual even by Greek standards. King Aegeus of Athens, desperate for an heir, had visited the oracle at Delphi and received a cryptic prophecy. On his way home, he stopped in Trojan and spent the night with Princess Aethra. That same night, Athena sent Aethra a dream commanding her to wade across to a nearby island. There, Poseidon came to her, and from this double union, one mortal, one divine, Theseus was conceived. This dual paternity gave Theseus both mortal legitimacy as heir to the Athenian throne and divine power as son of the sea god. Throughout his adventures, Poseidon protected and aided his son. When Theseus sailed to Crete to face the Minotaur, it was likely Poseidon's favor that ensured calm seas for the journey. When Theseus was challenged to prove his divine parentage by retrieving a ring thrown into the sea, he dove in and was welcomed to Poseidon's underwater palace. where Amphitrite herself gave him a crown and returned the ring along with additional treasures. Theseus became Athens' greatest hero, unifying the region of Attica, slaying bandits and monsters, establishing laws and festivals, and ruling as a just king. His connection to Poseidon was celebrated in Athens, even though Athena was the city's patron goddess, showing how the Greeks could honor multiple gods simultaneously without seeing contradiction. Another famous son of Poseidon was Orion, the giant hunter. Born to Poseidon and Euryale, daughter of Minos of Crete, Orion grew to enormous size and became the greatest hunter in the world. He could walk across the ocean floor with the water only reaching his shoulders, a gift from his father that allowed him to travel between islands and continents. His hunting prowess eventually led to conflict with Artemis, goddess of the hunt, and various myths describe different circumstances of his death. In the end, he was placed among the stars as the constellation that bears his name, forever pursuing the Pleiades across the night sky. Peleus and Neleus were twin sons of Poseidon and Tyro, a mortal woman who had been seduced by the god when he took the form of the river god she loved. The twins were abandoned at birth, but survived and were raised by shepherds. They eventually discovered their divine and royal heritage and claimed thrones in Thessaly and Pylos respectively. From them sprang important dynasties, including Nestor, the wise old king of Pylos, who would play a crucial role in the Trojan War. But not all of Poseidon's children were heroes or founders of dynasties. Some were monsters, beings of terrible power who threatened the order of the world. The most famous of these was Polyphemus, the Cyclops who imprisoned Odysseus and his men in his cave. Polyphemus was the son of Poseidon and the sea nymph Theusa. Unlike the three Cyclopes who had forged Zeus's thunderbolts and Poseidon's trident, Polyphemus was one of the younger generation of Cyclopes, savage shepherds who lived on an island and knew nothing of civilization. When Odysseus and his crew became trapped in Polyphemus's cave, the Cyclops began eating the men two at a time. Odysseus, clever as always, devised a plan. He got Polyphemus drunk on strong wine and told him his name was Nobody. When the Cyclops fell into a stupor, Odysseus and his men heated a massive wooden stake and drove it into Polyphemus's single eye, blinding him. When other Cyclopes came to investigate Polyphemus's screams and asked who was attacking him, he could only answer nobody. They assumed he was raving mad and left him to his fate. But as Odysseus sailed away, his pride got the better of him. He revealed his true name, boasting of his cleverness. Polyphemus, though blind, hurled massive boulders toward the sound of Odysseus's voice, nearly sinking the ships. Then he called out to his father Poseidon, praying for vengeance. Poseidon heard his son's prayer and cursed Odysseus to wander the seas for 10 years before reaching home, and even then to find trouble waiting for him. This curse would drive the entire plot of Homer's Odyssey, demonstrating that harming even a monster son of Poseidon carried severe consequences. From Poseidon's union with Medusa before her transformation into a Gorgon came two extraordinary children, Pegasus, the winged horse we've already discussed, and Chrysaor, a warrior born with a golden sword. Chrysaor became the father of the monster Geryon, the three-bodied giant whose cattle Heracles stole as one of his 12 labors, and the grandfather of Echidna, the mother of monsters who spawned the Sphinx, the Nemean lion, and many other creatures that plagued Greece. Poseidon sired numerous giants who became threats to mortals and gods alike. Antaeus, son of Poseidon and Gaia, was a giant who drew his strength from contact with the earth. He forced all travelers through Libya to wrestle with him, and he always won, decorating his father's temple with the skulls of his victims. Only Heracles managed to defeat him, lifting Antaeus off the ground and crushing him in a bear hug while the giant's earth-granted strength faded. Otus and Ephialtes, the Aloidae, were twin giants born to Poseidon and Iphimedia. They grew at an incredible rate, adding 9 fingers of height every year. In their arrogance, they attempted to storm Olympus itself, piling mountain upon mountain to create a stairway to heaven. They managed to capture Ares, the god of war, and imprison him in a bronze jar for 13 months before Hermes freed him. The twins were eventually killed by Apollo, who tricked them into accidentally spearing each other while hunting. Poseidon also fathered the Cercopes, mischievous monkey-like creatures who delighted in robbery and trickery. Heracles caught them trying to steal his weapons while he slept and hung them upside down from a pole across his shoulders. They made jokes about the hero's hairy buttocks, which amused Heracles so much that he let them go. Zeus later transformed them into monkeys or stone, depending on the version of the tale. Chrysaor, Chersion, Siren, and Procrustes were all said to be sons of Poseidon, who became notorious bandits and murderers, plaguing the roads of Greece until they were killed by heroes like Theseus. Their father's divine blood made them stronger and more dangerous than ordinary criminals, but it could not save them from justice. The variety of Poseidon's offspring reflects the Greek understanding of the sea itself. The ocean could be beautiful and nurturing, providing food and enabling trade, but it could also be deadly, swallowing ships and drowning sailors. It contained wonders like dolphins and terrors like sea monsters. Similarly, Poseidon's children ranged from noble heroes to horrific monsters, from helpful spirits to vicious killers. They embodied every aspect of their father's nature: his power, his creativity, his protection of those he favored, and his terrible wrath toward those who offended him. The sheer number and diversity of Poseidon's children also demonstrated his fertility and creative power. In a culture that valued large families and saw children as a form of immortality, a god who fathered so many offspring was displaying his virility and strength. Whether those children brought honor or horror to the world mattered less than the fact that Poseidon's bloodline spread far and wide, touching every corner of the Greek world and beyond. No story better demonstrates Poseidon's capacity for long-lasting anger and relentless pursuit than his persecution of Odysseus, the clever king of Ithaca. What began as a hero's justified defense against a monster became a decade-long ordeal that tested Odysseus to his absolute limits. It is a tale that shows both the power of the gods and the resilience of human cunning, and it all started with a single act of violence against one of Poseidon's monstrous sons. The trouble began on Odysseus's journey home from Troy. After 10 years of fighting in the Trojan War, he and his men were eager to return to their homes and families, but fate and poor decisions led them to the island of the Cyclopes, a land where the one-eyed giants lived in caves, tending their flocks and knowing nothing of civilization, laws, or hospitality. Odysseus, curious as always, decided to explore. Against the advice of his men, he took 12 companions and entered a cave filled with cheeses, milk, and sheep pens. They helped themselves to the food, assuming they were claiming the customary rights of guests. But the owner of the cave was no hospitable shepherd. It was Polyphemus, son of Poseidon, a savage giant who stood twice the height of a man and whose single eye glowed with bestial hunger. When Polyphemus returned with his flocks, he rolled a massive boulder across the cave entrance, trapping the men inside. Then he discovered the intruders. Rather than offer the traditional Greek hospitality that even strangers could expect, he grabbed 2 of Odysseus's men, smashed them against the cave floor, and ate them raw for his dinner. He did the same at breakfast, consuming 2 more men while Odysseus and the survivors watched in horror. Odysseus knew that simply killing the Cyclops wouldn't save them. The boulder blocking the entrance was so massive that no human could move it. If Polyphemus died, they would be trapped forever. So he devised a more cunning plan. He offered Polyphemus wine, strong, undiluted wine that quickly intoxicated the giant who had never tasted such nectar before. As Polyphemus drank, Odysseus told him that his name was Utis, or nobody, a clever lie that would serve him well. When the Cyclops finally passed out in a drunken stupor, Odysseus and his men took a massive olive wood stake they had sharpened and hardened in the fire. Together, they drove it deep into Polyphemus's single eye, twisting it like a drill as the giant's eye hissed and bubbled. The Cyclops awoke screaming in agony, thrashing about the cave while the men scattered and hid among the sheep. The other Cyclopes on the island heard Polyphemus's cries and gathered outside his cave, asking what troubled him. "Nobody is killing me," Polyphemus howled. "Nobody has blinded me." The other giants, thinking he was either mad or ill, told him to pray to his father Poseidon and left him to his suffering. In the morning, blind Polyphemus had to let his sheep out to pasture. He rolled back the boulder and sat in the entrance, feeling each animal as it passed to make sure no men escaped on their backs. But Odysseus had anticipated this. He and his men tied themselves underneath the largest rams, clinging to their wool bellies as the animals walked out. Polyphemus felt the sheep's backs, but never thought to check underneath. Once free and back on their ships, Odysseus made a fatal mistake. Pride overcame wisdom. As they rowed away, he couldn't resist shouting back to the blind giant, revealing his true identity. "If anyone asks who blinded you," he called out, "tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." Polyphemus, though blind and defeated, had one weapon left: prayer to his father. He raised his arms to the sky and called upon Poseidon, god of the sea, earth-shaker, his father. He prayed that Odysseus would never reach home, or if the fates decreed he must return, let it be late, in a broken ship, having lost all his companions, and let him find trouble waiting in his house. He ended by hurling massive boulders in the direction of Odysseus's voice, nearly sinking the ships with the waves the impacts created. Poseidon heard his son's prayer. Though Polyphemus was a monster, he was still Poseidon's child, and the god's rage at his maiming was absolute. From that moment, Poseidon pursued Odysseus across the Mediterranean, determined to make him suffer. The 10-year journey that followed was a catalogue of disasters, most of them orchestrated or worsened by Poseidon's anger. When Odysseus's ships approached the island of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, Poseidon ensured that even the gift of favorable winds would turn against him. Aeolus gave Odysseus a bag containing all the adverse winds, keeping them bound so the hero could sail home safely. But Odysseus's men, thinking the bag contained treasure, opened it while their captains slept. The winds burst forth, driving the ships all the way back to where they'd started. At the land of the Laestrygonians, Poseidon allowed the cannibal giants to destroy 11 of Odysseus's 12 ships, leaving only the king's own vessel intact. Hundreds of men died, crushed by boulders or eaten by giants, while Poseidon watched without intervention. On Circe's island, Odysseus and his remaining men were detained for a year. Though this was not directly Poseidon's doing, the god made no effort to hurry them along. Then came the terrible journey past the Sirens, whose song lured sailors to their deaths. Odysseus heard their music, tied to the mast while his men rowed with waxed ears, unable to hear the deadly temptation. The passage between Scylla and Charybdis was particularly harrowing. Charybdis, the whirlpool monster who swallowed the sea 3 times a day, may have been intensified by Poseidon's power. Odysseus chose to sail closer to Scylla, the 6-headed monster, losing 6 men to her snapping jaws rather than risk the entire ship to the whirlpool. The screams of his men being devoured would haunt him forever. When they finally reached the island of Thrinacia, where Helios, the sun god, kept his sacred cattle, Odysseus begged his men not to harm the animals. But starvation drove them to slaughter some of the cattle while Odysseus slept. Helios demanded vengeance from Zeus, threatening to shine his light in the underworld instead of on earth if he wasn't satisfied. Zeus agreed to punish the men, and Poseidon seized the opportunity. As Odysseus's ship sailed away from the island, Zeus sent a storm and struck the vessel with a thunderbolt. Every man except Odysseus drowned. The king of Ithaca clung to debris from his shattered ship, and the currents, controlled by Poseidon, carried him straight to Charybdis. He barely survived by grabbing the branches of a fig tree growing above the whirlpool, hanging there until the maelstrom released the mast he'd been clinging to. Poseidon's currents then carried Odysseus to Ogygia, the island home of the nymph Calypso, daughter of the Titan Atlas. There he remained trapped for 7 years. Calypso fell in love with him and offered him immortality if he would stay with her forever. But Odysseus refused, longing only for his mortal wife Penelope and his home in Ithaca. Calypso kept him anyway, unable to let him go, and Poseidon made sure no passing ship would find the isolated island. Only when Zeus finally ordered Calypso to release Odysseus did the long captivity end. But Poseidon wasn't finished. As Odysseus sailed on a raft toward the land of the Phaeacians, the sea god spotted him. In a rage that the other gods had helped his enemy, Poseidon raised a massive storm, waves like mountains, winds like hammer blows. The raft was smashed to pieces, and Odysseus would have drowned if the sea goddess Ino hadn't taken pity on him, giving him her veil to keep him afloat. Odysseus swam for 2 days and 2 nights, while Poseidon battered him with waves. When he finally reached the shore of Scheria, the Phaeacian land, he was battered, naked, crusted with salt, and barely alive. The Phaeacians, a people beloved by the gods and particularly blessed with seafaring skill, took him in. King Alcinous and his daughter Nausicaa showed him the hospitality that Polyphemus had denied, and they agreed to take him home to Ithaca on one of their magical ships. These Phaeacian ships were unlike any others. They needed no oars or steering, sailing by thought alone, and they could cross vast distances in a single night. They carried Odysseus swiftly to Ithaca while he slept, finally bringing him home after 20 years away, 10 at Troy and 10 wandering. They left him sleeping on the beach, surrounded by the gifts the Phaeacians had given him. But Poseidon's anger had not been fully satisfied. When the Phaeacian ship turned for home, the sea god was waiting. Just as the vessel approached the harbor of Scheria, with crowds watching from the shore, Poseidon struck the ship with his hand and turned it to stone. The ship and all its sailors were transformed into a rock that looked like a ship under sail, forever frozen just outside the harbor as a warning and a monument to Poseidon's wrath. King Alcinous recognized the fulfillment of an old prophecy that Poseidon would one day punish the Phaeacians for their easy assistance to travelers. The king immediately ordered sacrifices to Poseidon, begging the god not to close off their harbor with mountains, as the prophecy had also warned. Whether those sacrifices satisfied Poseidon or whether he felt his revenge against Odysseus's helpers was complete is unclear. But the Phaeacians never forgot the price of angering the sea god. As for Odysseus, he reached Ithaca at last, but Polyphemus's prayer had been answered in every detail. He arrived late, after 20 years away. His ship was destroyed, all his companions were dead, and when he reached his house, he found it overrun by suitors trying to force his wife Penelope to remarry. Convinced that Odysseus was dead, he had to fight to reclaim his own home, eventually slaughtering over 100 men with the help of his son Telemachus and the goddess Athena. The story of Odysseus and Poseidon is more than just a tale of divine revenge. It illustrates several important aspects of Greek religious thought. First, it shows that harming even a monstrous child of a god carries consequences. Polyphemus was a savage who violated the sacred rules of hospitality, but he was still Poseidon's son, and that relationship demanded the father's protection and vengeance. Second, it demonstrates that divine anger can be implacable and long-lasting. Poseidon pursued Odysseus for a decade, never relenting, never forgetting. The gods were not like humans who might eventually cool off or be distracted by other concerns. Their memories were eternal, and their capacity for vengeance matched their power. Third, it shows the limits of divine power even in revenge. Poseidon could make Odysseus's journey miserable, could destroy his ships and kill his men, could delay him for years, but he couldn't prevent Odysseus from eventually reaching home because fate and the other gods had decreed that he would return. Even Poseidon had to work within certain constraints, though he pushed those constraints as far as they would go. Finally, the story highlights the importance of cleverness and endurance in Greek culture. Odysseus survived not through superior strength. He couldn't outmuscle Polyphemus or outfight Poseidon's storms, but through intelligence, adaptability, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. These were qualities the Greeks admired, perhaps even more than physical prowess. Odysseus the clever Polytropos, the man of many ways, became a model for how mortals could navigate a world controlled by powers far greater than themselves. The tale also served as a warning to sailors. Poseidon's wrath was real and terrible. One could not simply act with impunity on the seas, even in self-defense against monsters. Proper sacrifices, respect, and humility were essential. The sea was Poseidon's domain absolutely, and those who sailed upon it did so at his pleasure. Odysseus had forgotten this in his moment of prideful boasting, and he paid for that forgetfulness with 10 years of suffering. Yet there's also a sense in the story that Poseidon's revenge, while terrible, was not unjust by Greek standards. Odysseus had maimed the god's son. The principle of reciprocity, of answering harm with harm, was fundamental to Greek morality. Poseidon was doing what any father might do, protecting his child and punishing the one who had injured him. The fact that Polyphemus was a monster who had eaten Odysseus's men first was almost irrelevant. Family loyalty transcended questions of the victim's character. In the end, Odysseus and Poseidon reached an understanding. Some traditions say that Odysseus, following a prophecy from the seer Tiresias, eventually made a pilgrimage inland, carrying an oar, until he reached people who had never seen the sea. There he planted the oar and made a sacrifice to Poseidon, finally securing the god's forgiveness. Others say that the slaughter of the suitors and the restoration of order in Ithaca was itself a kind of closure, the final answer to Polyphemus's prayer that Odysseus find trouble in his house. The wrath of Poseidon against Odysseus became one of the defining stories of Greek mythology, retold by Homer in the Odyssey and referenced by countless later writers. It showed that even the cleverest hero could not escape the anger of the gods, but also that with enough courage and cunning, one might survive it. The sea god's power was absolute, but not quite infinite. There were limits, boundaries set by fate and by the other gods. And for mortals willing to endure, there might eventually be a homecoming, however delayed and costly. Poseidon's importance in Greek religion was reflected in the numerous temples, sanctuaries, and festivals dedicated to him throughout the Greek world. While he never achieved the universal prominence of Zeus or the intense local devotion enjoyed by Athena in Athens, his worship was widespread and deeply integrated into Greek life, particularly in coastal communities and regions with strong maritime traditions. The most important sanctuary of Poseidon was located at the Isthmus of Corinth, that narrow strip of land connecting the Peloponnese to mainland Greece. Here stood the temple of Poseidon at Isthmia, a site sacred to the god since at least the early Archaic period. The sanctuary was situated on the southern side of the isthmus, overlooking the Saronic Gulf, in a location that controlled one of the most strategic passages in Greece. Archaeological excavations have revealed the foundations of several successive temples on the site. The earliest was constructed around 700 BCE, a modest structure that was later replaced by a larger limestone temple around 465 BCE, after the earlier building was destroyed, possibly by fire. This later temple followed the typical Greek design, with a rectangular central chamber surrounded by columns measuring approximately 22 by 53 meters. The temple's decoration included sculptures depicting scenes from mythology, though sadly few of these have survived. But the temple at Isthmia was famous not just as a place of worship, but as the home of the Isthmian Games, one of the four major Pan-Hellenic festivals alongside the Olympics, Pythian Games, and Nemean Games. The Isthmian Games were held every 2 years in the spring, attracting athletes and spectators from across the Greek world. According to tradition, they were founded either by Theseus in honor of his father Poseidon, or by Sisyphus, the legendary king of Corinth, in memory of his nephew Melicertes. The games included athletic competitions similar to those at Olympia: foot races, wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, and the brutal pancration that combined elements of both wrestling and boxing. There were also equestrian events, chariot racing and horse racing, particularly appropriate for a god associated with horses. Musical and poetic competitions were added in later periods, expanding the scope of the festival. Winners at the Isthmian Games originally received a crown of pine branches, though this was later changed to a crown of withered celery. These wreaths had symbolic meaning, connecting the victors to Poseidon and to the heroes who had died young, for celery was associated with death and the underworld. The games were suspended during wartime, and a sacred truce allowed athletes and spectators to travel safely to and from Isthmia, regardless of ongoing conflicts. The rituals at Isthmia included sacrifices to Poseidon, typically of bulls, those powerful animals that represented the god's strength and occasionally violent nature. Black bulls were particularly favored. The blood was poured onto altars, and portions of the meat were burned for the god, while the rest was distributed among worshippers in a sacred feast. These communal meals reinforced social bonds and allowed people to share in the god's bounty. Another major temple of Poseidon stood at Cape Sounion, the southernmost tip of Attica. This sanctuary occupied a dramatic location atop a cliff overlooking the Aegean Sea, visible to ships passing between the mainland and the Cycladic islands. The temple at Sounion was built around 440 BCE during Athens' Golden Age, constructed of local marble with slender Doric columns, 15 of which still stand today, offering one of the most picturesque ancient sites in Greece. Sailors passing Sounion would offer prayers and sacrifices to Poseidon, asking for protection on their voyages. The temple's location made it a natural place for such rituals. Ships could pause in the harbor below, and crews could climb the rocky path to make their offerings before continuing their journey. The sight of the temple gleaming white against the blue sea and sky was said to bring comfort to sailors, a reminder that they were under the god's watchful eye. The Athenians held a festival called the Sounion every year, with a procession from Athens to the Cape. This festival included boat races in the harbor below the temple, athletic competitions, and of course sacrifices to Poseidon. The journey to Sounion was itself a form of worship, taking the Athenians out of their city and bringing them face to face with the sea that was so central to their prosperity and survival. In the heart of Athens itself, Poseidon had a significant presence despite losing the contest for the city's patronage to Athena. On the Acropolis stood the Erechtheion, a complex temple dedicated to multiple deities, including both Athena and Poseidon. The northern porch of the Erechtheion covered the spot where Poseidon had struck his trident into the rock during the contest with Athena. The marks of the trident, 3 grooves in the stone, were supposedly still visible in ancient times, and the salt spring that Poseidon had created still flowed in a chamber beneath the temple. The worship of Poseidon at the Erechtheion included sacrifices and libations, though on a smaller scale than those at Sounion or Isthmia. The priests who tended the sanctuary maintained both Athena's sacred olive tree and Poseidon's marks and spring, a physical representation of how the two deities coexisted in Athens even after Athena's victory. At Helike in Achaea, there was once a magnificent temple of Poseidon Helikonios that served as the meeting place of the Achaean League, a confederation of Greek city-states. This sanctuary was so important that the Ionians, when they migrated to Asia Minor, requested and received permission to continue sending delegations to worship there. The temple housed a bronze statue of Poseidon and was the site of major festivals that drew worshippers from across the northern Peloponnese. Tragically, in 373 BCE, an earthquake and tsunami destroyed Helike completely. The city sank beneath the waves, and the temple was lost. Ancient writers recorded that the catastrophe occurred at night during winter, giving the inhabitants no warning. The sea rushed in, covering the city so completely that only the tops of trees remained visible. Some said the disaster was divine punishment for Helike's mistreatment of Ionian envoys. Others saw it simply as Poseidon's terrible power manifest. The site of Helike was lost for over 2,000 years until modern archaeologists rediscovered it using ground-penetrating radar and excavation. In Thessaly, particularly around the region of Onchestos, Poseidon was worshipped primarily in his capacity as a horse god rather than as lord of the sea. The sanctuary at Onchestos included sacred groves and a hippodrome where games were held in his honor. Horse breeders from across Thessaly would bring their finest animals to be blessed by Poseidon's priests, and successful breeders would dedicate bronze statues of horses as thank offerings. The island of Tinos in the Cyclades was another important center of Poseidon worship. Here the god was honored as the island's primary deity, and a major sanctuary drew pilgrims from nearby islands. The Tinians celebrated Poseidon's role in stabilizing their island, for according to local tradition, Poseidon had anchored Tinos to the sea floor to prevent it from drifting. Throughout the Greek world, smaller sanctuaries, shrines, and altars dedicated to Poseidon could be found in harbors, at springs, near fords and bridges, and anywhere that people interacted closely with water. Fishing villages would have modest shrines where fishermen could make small offerings before heading out each morning. Cities with important harbors maintained altars where merchants and sailors could sacrifice before voyages. The types of offerings made to Poseidon varied, depending on the worshipper's wealth and the specific favor being sought. Bulls were the most prestigious and expensive sacrifice, appropriate for major festivals or when seeking significant aid. Horses were sometimes sacrificed, particularly in Thessaly and Arcadia, though this was less common given their value. Smaller livestock, rams and goats, were more typical for individual worshippers. The very poor might offer only wine, olive oil, or barley cakes. Some offerings were never meant to be burned or consumed. Sailors might throw valuable objects overboard as offerings to Poseidon, letting them sink to the sea floor to adorn his underwater palace. Successful merchants returning from profitable voyages might dedicate a portion of their cargo at his temples. Those who survived storms often dedicated model ships, as thank offerings, hanging them in Poseidon's sanctuaries as permanent testimony to his power to save as well as to destroy. Poseidon's festivals often included processions to the sea, ritual bathing and boat races. The god's association with horses meant that equestrian events were featured prominently. Music and poetry competitions celebrated his myths and deeds. Communal feasting reinforced social bonds within communities and reminded worshippers that the god's blessings were meant to be shared. One unique aspect of Poseidon worship was the practice of throwing horses into the sea as sacrifices. This occurred in several locations, most notably at various headlands and capes where the sea was particularly treacherous. The horses, often white ones sacred to Poseidon, would be driven off cliffs or pushed from boats, returning to the god who had created them. To modern sensibilities, this seems cruel, but to the ancient Greeks, it represented giving back to Poseidon what was originally his, and the horses' deaths were considered honorable, serving a sacred purpose. The worship of Poseidon was not just about seeking favors or avoiding disasters. It was about maintaining proper relationships with a power that was essential to Greek life. The sea provided food, enabled trade, connected scattered communities, and offered opportunities for exploration and colonization. But it was also dangerous, unpredictable, and deadly. Earthquakes could strike without warning, toppling buildings and killing thousands. Fresh water sources could fail, bringing drought and famine. By honoring Poseidon through temples, festivals, and sacrifices, the Greeks were acknowledging their dependence on forces beyond their control and trying to stay in the god's good graces. They were participating in a cosmic order where gods and mortals each had their roles and responsibilities. The humans provided worship, respect, and offerings. In return, the gods provided protection, blessing, and the basic conditions that made life possible. The temples themselves served multiple functions. They were houses for the god, containing statues that were not mere representations, but actual dwellings for the divine presence. They were treasuries where valuable offerings accumulated over time, often becoming wealthy institutions that could lend money and finance civic projects. They were meeting places where communities gathered for festivals and political assemblies. They were refugees where those seeking asylum could find temporary protection. And they were symbols of civic identity and religious devotion visible from great distances. When we look at the ruins of Poseidon's temples today, standing on windswept capes or buried beneath Mediterranean waters, we're seeing the remains of a living religious tradition that sustained Greek civilization for over 1,000 years. These were not abstract monuments to an abstract concept, but active centers of worship where people sought real help from a god they believed was truly present and truly powerful. The prayers spoken, the blood spilled, the hymns sung at these sites were all part of an ongoing dialogue between humanity and the divine, a conversation that shaped the ancient world. While Poseidon's most famous conflicts were with individual heroes like Odysseus, the sea god also played significant roles in the great wars that defined Greek mythology, particularly the Trojan War. His involvement in these larger conflicts reveals much about his character, his relationships with other gods, and his complex feelings about mortals. Poseidon's connection to Troy was old and bitter, dating back to a time before the famous war that would destroy the city. The story begins with another rebellion, another case of gods overstepping their bounds. Poseidon and Apollo, along with some accounts including Athena, had conspired against Zeus. Their rebellion failed, and as punishment, Zeus sent both Poseidon and Apollo to serve a mortal for a year. That mortal was Laomedon, king of Troy. In some versions of this myth, the two gods came to Troy in disguise, presenting themselves as ordinary workmen. Laomedon hired them to build the great walls of Troy, those legendary fortifications that would later withstand 10 years of Greek siege. Poseidon, god of earthquakes, knew how to build walls that could resist even his own power to shake the earth. Apollo, god of plague and healing, added his own protections to the structure. Together they created walls so mighty that they seemed unbreakable. When the year was complete and the walls stood finished, Poseidon and Apollo asked Laomedon for their wages. The king, either not realizing who they truly were or simply refusing to pay, sent them away with insults and threats. Some versions say he even threatened to cut off their ears and sell them into slavery. This betrayal of the wage agreement and the violation of basic justice enraged both gods. Poseidon sent a sea monster to ravage the Trojan coast, a creature that emerged from the waves to devour people and livestock. Apollo sent a plague that killed many Trojans. Laomedon, desperate to save his city, consulted an oracle and was told he must sacrifice his daughter Hesione to the sea monster. The princess was chained to the rocks to await her fate, but the hero Heracles happened to pass by on one of his adventures. He agreed to kill the monster in exchange for Laomedon's divine horses, gifts from Zeus. Heracles succeeded in slaying the monster, but once again Laomedon refused to pay what he had promised. The hero left Troy, but returned later with an army, destroyed the city, killed Laomedon and most of his sons, and took Hesione as a slave. Only one son survived Priam, who would rebuild Troy and rule it during the famous war. This history meant that Poseidon harbored deep resentment toward Troy long before Paris abducted Helen. When the Trojan War began, Poseidon sided with the Greeks, the Achaeans who had sailed across the Aegean to reclaim Helen and punish Paris. But his support was complicated by the politics of Olympus and by his complex relationship with his brother Zeus. Zeus, for his own reasons, favored the Trojans during much of the war. Perhaps he remembered Laomedon's son Ganymede, whom Zeus had taken to Olympus to serve as cupbearer. Perhaps he was honoring promises made to Thetis, who had asked him to help the Trojans so that her son Achilles would receive greater glory when he finally entered the battle. Whatever his reasons, Zeus commanded the other gods not to interfere in the war, wanting events to unfold according to his design. This command frustrated Poseidon immensely. He watched from his underwater palace as the Greeks struggled against the Trojans. He saw Hector, Troy's greatest champion, driving the Achaeans back toward their ships. He knew that if the Trojans succeeded in burning the Greek fleet, the war would be over and Troy would survive. Everything in him wanted to intervene, to help the Greeks whom he favored, to punish the city that had cheated him. Finally, Poseidon could restrain himself no longer. When Zeus was distracted, seduced, and put to sleep by Hera, who also favored the Greeks, Poseidon descended to the battlefield. He took the form of the seer Calchas and moved among the Greek warriors, filling them with renewed courage and strength. His presence rallied the Achaeans, and they began to push back against the Trojan advance. Homer's Iliad describes Poseidon's arrival on the battlefield in magnificent detail. The sea god drove his chariot from his underwater palace, and the sea creatures recognized their lord, sporting joyfully in the waves. The sea parted before him, and even the rocky sea floor trembled at his passage. When he reached the Greek camp, he took the form of a great warrior and moved through the ranks, his voice booming encouragement, his divine presence filling mortal hearts with supernatural courage. Under Poseidon's influence, the Greeks fought with renewed vigor. They held the line against Hector's assault and even began to push the Trojans back from the ships. The tide of battle shifted, and for a time it seemed the Greeks might gain a decisive advantage. Poseidon moved invisibly among them, guiding spears to their targets, turning aside Trojan arrows, strengthening shield walls that should have broken. But Zeus eventually awoke and saw what Poseidon had done. His anger was terrible. He sent Apollo to counter Poseidon's interference, restoring balance to the battlefield. Zeus reminded Poseidon that no god was to interfere, and though Poseidon argued that he had as much right to help as Zeus had to hinder, he eventually withdrew. The sea god retreated to his underwater realm, seething with frustration but unable to directly defy Zeus's command. This pattern repeated throughout the war. Poseidon would find ways to help the Greeks indirectly, sending favorable winds for their ships, ensuring that fish filled their nets to feed the army, perhaps using his earthquakes to damage Trojan buildings. But he could not intervene openly on the battlefield again without risking Zeus's full wrath. When Achilles finally returned to battle after Patroclus' death, Poseidon watched with satisfaction as the greatest Greek warrior tore through the Trojan ranks. When Achilles fought the river god's commander, who tried to drown him for filling the river with corpses, Poseidon considered helping but held back, knowing that other gods were watching and that Zeus's restrictions still applied. The final destruction of Troy brought Poseidon mixed feelings. On one hand, he had finally seen the city punished for its ancient crime against him. The walls he had built were breached by trickery rather than force, which perhaps satisfied his sense of irony. The Greeks had won, the side he had favored, and Laomedon's line had paid the ultimate price. But the manner of Troy's fall troubled even Poseidon. The Greeks had desecrated temples, raped priestesses, murdered children, and violated every law of proper warfare. When Ajax the Lesser dragged the prophet Cassandra from Athena's temple and violated her there, even Poseidon was shocked by the sacrilege. The Greeks had become as bad as the Trojans they were punishing. So when the war ended and the Greeks prepared to sail home, Poseidon joined with other gods to punish them for their excesses. The sea god raised terrible storms that scattered the Greek fleet. Many ships were destroyed, smashed against rocks, or driven onto hostile shores. Heroes who had survived 10 years of war drowned in sight of home. Ajax the Lesser, who had committed the worst sacrilege, was struck by Poseidon's trident and drowned when he boasted that he had escaped the sea god's wrath. This dual punishment of both Troy and the Greeks who destroyed it reflected Poseidon's complex sense of justice. He would see wrongs punished, whether committed against him personally or against the basic laws of civilization. He favored those who honored him, but would turn against them if they went too far. Loyalty to one side did not mean tolerance for any behavior. There were lines that should not be crossed, and when mortals crossed them, even mortals he had previously helped, Poseidon's wrath would fall upon them. The Trojan War also demonstrated Poseidon's position in the divine hierarchy. He was powerful enough to influence the war's outcome, respected enough that his interventions mattered, but still subordinate to Zeus in ways that frustrated him. He had to resort to trickery and indirect action, waiting for moments when Zeus was distracted. This reinforced what the division of the cosmos had established. Zeus was king, and Poseidon, though mighty, was not. In later conflicts, Poseidon continued to involve himself when maritime concerns were at stake. During the Persian Wars, when the Greek city-states faced invasion from the vast Persian Empire, Poseidon was credited with raising the storm that destroyed much of the Persian fleet at Cape Sapius. The Athenians believed Poseidon favored them during their naval battles, particularly the decisive victory at Salamis, where Greek triremes outmaneuvered the larger Persian ships in narrow waters. The role Poseidon played in these wars, both mythical and historical, shows how the Greeks integrated their gods into every aspect of life, including warfare. Victory was never just a matter of better tactics or braver soldiers. The gods were always involved, helping or hindering according to their own interests and relationships. A general who forgot to sacrifice to Poseidon before launching ships risked not just bad luck, but active divine opposition. A city that honored Poseidon properly could expect his help in naval battles and his protection for their harbor. Poseidon's involvement in war also reflected Greek understanding of the sea's military importance. Naval power determined which cities would thrive and which would struggle. Control of sea lanes meant control of trade. The ability to move troops and supplies by ship often decided conflicts. Poseidon, as master of the seas, thus became a military deity as much as a fertility god or protector of sailors. His favor could decide wars, and his wrath could doom even the mightiest fleet. When Rome conquered the Greek world, they didn't simply discard Greek religion. Instead, they absorbed it, identifying their own gods with Greek equivalents and adopting many Greek myths wholesale. In this process of religious and cultural fusion, Poseidon became Neptune, and while many aspects of the god remained the same, the transformation revealed interesting differences between Greek and Roman religious sensibilities. Neptune was not originally a sea god in early Roman religion. The etymology of his name is uncertain, but it may derive from the Latin word nebula, meaning cloud or mist, suggesting an original connection to atmospheric moisture rather than the ocean itself. In the earliest Roman traditions, Neptune appears to have been a god of fresh water, particularly of springs, streams, and rain. He was paired with Salacia, whose name connects to sal, meaning salt, suggesting she represented the salty aspects of water, while Neptune represented the fresh. This early Neptune was celebrated at the Neptunalia, a festival held in late July during the hottest part of the summer, when fresh water was most precious. Romans would build temporary shelters of branches and leaves, perhaps representing the protection that trees provided for springs, and they would celebrate with wine and games. The festival had a rustic, pastoral character, quite different from the maritime focus of Poseidon worship. As Rome expanded and came into greater contact with Greek culture, particularly after conquering southern Italy, where Greek colonies had existed for centuries, Neptune began to be equated with Poseidon. This identification was natural, given that both were water deities, but it fundamentally transformed Neptune's character. The quiet god of springs and rain became lord of the seas, master of storms, wielder of the trident. By the time of the Roman Empire, Neptune had fully assumed Poseidon's attributes and myths. Roman poets like Virgil and Ovid retold the Greek stories, sometimes with Roman names and Roman settings, but largely preserving the Greek narratives. Neptune appeared in Virgil's Aeneid, the epic that told of Rome's legendary founding, playing much the same role that Poseidon had played in Greek epics. In the Aeneid, Neptune's relationship with the Trojan hero Aeneas is complex and revealing. Aeneas, son of Venus, Aphrodite, and ancestor of Romulus and Remus, who would found Rome, fled burning Troy, carrying his father on his back and leading his son by the hand. His long journey to Italy, where he would establish the settlement that would eventually become Rome, was filled with dangers and divine interference. Neptune appears in the Aeneid as a powerful but generally benevolent figure toward Aeneas. When Juno, Hera, attempts to destroy the Trojan fleet with storms, Neptune becomes angry that another deity has interfered in his domain without permission. He calms the seas and rebukes the winds, demonstrating his absolute authority over maritime matters. The scene is one of the most famous in Latin literature, with Neptune rising from the waves to still the storm, asserting his sovereignty over the seas. This portrayal reveals both continuity and change from the Greek Poseidon. Neptune retains the sea god's power and pride, his insistence on proper respect for his authority. But the Roman Neptune seems somewhat more dignified, more lawful, less prone to the volatile mood swings that characterize Poseidon. This reflects broader differences between Greek and Roman approaches to the gods. The Romans emphasized the contractual nature of religious relationships, the idea that proper sacrifices and rituals would result in divine favor, a more orderly and predictable system than the sometimes chaotic Greek divine politics. Neptune became an important deity for the Roman navy and for cities with significant maritime commerce. The port of Ostia, which served as Rome's harbor before silting made it unusable, had temples dedicated to Neptune. Sailors and merchants made offerings to him before voyages, much as Greek sailors had honored Poseidon. The Roman navy incorporated Neptune's imagery into their standards and decorations, seeking his protection in battles at sea. Interestingly, despite this maritime focus, the Romans never developed quite the same intimate relationship with Neptune that coastal Greek cities had with Poseidon. Rome itself was not a maritime city in its earliest years, being located inland along the Tiber River. Roman culture was more focused on land-based military conquest and agriculture. While they eventually built a powerful navy and controlled the Mediterranean, which they called Mare Nostrum, our sea, their identity was less tied to seafaring than that of island-dwelling Greeks. The Romans also associated Neptune with horses, inheriting this connection from Poseidon. The Circus Maximus in Rome, the great chariot racing stadium, featured a shrine to Neptune, and chariot racers would sometimes invoke his name. But this equine aspect was less prominent in Roman worship than it had been in certain Greek regions like Arcadia. Roman art depicted Neptune very similarly to how Greeks had depicted Poseidon, a bearded, mature man with a powerful build, typically holding a trident. He might be shown standing in a chariot pulled by hippocamps or riding a dolphin. His imagery appeared on coins, in mosaics, in sculptures, and in frescoes throughout the Roman world. These depictions helped spread a consistent visual iconography that has influenced how Neptune Poseidon has been portrayed in art ever since. One significant difference in Roman worship was the emphasis on Neptune's role in connection to other agricultural and seasonal deities. The Neptunalia festival, even as it absorbed some Greek maritime elements, retained its character as a celebration during the height of summer, associated with water's life-giving properties in the dry season. This agricultural connection was less prominent in Greek Poseidon worship, which focused more heavily on maritime and seismic aspects. As Christianity spread through the Roman Empire and eventually became the state religion, Neptune's worship declined, along with that of all pagan gods. Temples were closed or converted to churches. Festivals were banned or transformed into Christian celebrations. The old gods were reframed as demons or dismissed as mere myths. Neptune, who had once commanded the seas and shaken the earth, became a character in stories rather than an active presence deserving worship. But Neptune never entirely disappeared from Western culture. During the Renaissance, when scholars and artists looked back to classical antiquity for inspiration, Neptune was rediscovered along with the rest of the Greco-Roman pantheon. He appeared in paintings, sculptures, fountains, and literature. Poets invoked him metaphorically. Kings and emperors adopted his imagery to represent naval power. The Fountain of Neptune in Rome, created by Giacomo della Porta in the late 16th century, shows the god commanding sea creatures in the heart of the city. The Trevi Fountain, perhaps Rome's most famous fountain, features Ocean, Oceanus, in the central niche, a related sea deity, demonstrating the continued fascination with these maritime figures. In Bologna, the Fountain of Neptune by Giambologna became an iconic symbol of the city. Britain's Royal Navy adopted Neptune, or sometimes his Greek name Poseidon, as an unofficial patron, decorating ships with tridents and holding crossing the line ceremonies when ships cross the equator, featuring a sailor dressed as King Neptune. This tradition continues to the present day, showing how the ancient god has been transformed from object of worship to cultural symbol. The transformation of Poseidon into Neptune, and Neptune's eventual evolution from god to symbol, reflects the complex ways that religious ideas persist, change, and adapt across time and culture. The basic conception of a powerful deity associated with the sea proved durable enough to survive translation from Greek to Roman contexts, and then to survive in altered form even the rise of Christianity. While modern people don't sacrifice bulls to Neptune before sea voyages, the image of the bearded god with his trident remains instantly recognizable, a testament to the lasting power of ancient mythology. More than 2,000 years after the last animal was sacrificed at his temples, Poseidon remains a living presence in human culture. Not as an object of worship, though there are small groups of modern pagans who do honor the old gods, but as a symbol, a story, an archetype that continues to resonate. The god who ruled the seas and shook the earth has found new life in literature, art, film, and the collective imagination. Poseidon's image is instantly recognizable. The bearded figure with the trident has become universal shorthand for ocean power and maritime authority. When a company wants to suggest strength and reliability in water-related activities, they often invoke his imagery. Shipping companies, fishing fleets, naval organizations, and maritime museums worldwide feature tridents and stylized waves in their logos. The University of Michigan, whose stadium is nicknamed the Big House, uses a trident as part of its athletic symbolism. The Seattle Mariners baseball team incorporates maritime imagery that ultimately traces back to Poseidon's iconography. In literature, Poseidon has appeared in countless retellings of classical myths and in entirely new stories that borrow his character. Modern authors have reimagined him for contemporary audiences, sometimes keeping close to the original myths, sometimes taking creative liberties. Rick Riordan's Percy Jackson series made Poseidon the father of a modern teenage hero who must navigate both the mortal world and the realm of the gods. These books introduced millions of young readers to Greek mythology, using Poseidon as a bridge between ancient stories and contemporary concerns. The Percy Jackson series portrays Poseidon sympathetically as a father who cares deeply for his son, but is constrained by divine laws from showing that affection openly. This interpretation highlights aspects present in the original myths: Poseidon's protectiveness toward his children, his conflicts with Zeus and divine authority, his power tempered by limitations. By making these ancient dynamics relevant to modern readers dealing with absent parents and institutional constraints, Riordan demonstrated the continuing relevance of Poseidon's stories. Other contemporary fantasy authors have used Poseidon in various ways. Some portray him as a villain, emphasizing his wrath and jealousy. Others present him as a tragic figure, a god diminished from his former glory. Still others reimagine him entirely, divorcing his character from the classical sources while keeping the basic associations with the sea. Each interpretation says something about how modern culture understands power, nature, authority, and the relationship between humanity and the forces beyond our control. In film and television, Poseidon has made numerous appearances. The 1981 film Clash of the Titans and its 2010 remake featured him prominently, though both took significant liberties with the myths. The Percy Jackson books were adapted into films that brought Poseidon to life on screen, played by Kevin McKidd. Various animated features and television series have included him as a character, often simplified for younger audiences, but retaining his essential attributes: power over the sea, the trident, the temperamental nature. The 1972 disaster film The Poseidon Adventure and its 2006 remake Poseidon used the god's name for ocean liners destroyed by massive waves, invoking his power over the sea and his capacity for destruction. Even when Poseidon doesn't appear as a character, his name carries connotations of oceanic danger and overwhelming force. Video games have also embraced Poseidon. The God of War series features him as a major antagonist, though in a heavily reimagined version of Greek mythology. Assassin's Creed Odyssey, set in ancient Greece, includes references to Poseidon and his worship. Countless strategy games, role-playing games, and adventure games have included Poseidon as a deity who can grant powers, as an enemy to be defeated, or as a source of maritime-themed abilities and equipment. The scientific community has honored Poseidon in its own way. The eighth planet from the Sun, Neptune, was named after Poseidon's Roman equivalent, continuing the tradition of naming planets after classical deities. The planet's distinctive blue color, caused by methane in its atmosphere, evokes the deep blue of the ocean. One of Neptune's moons is named Triton, after Poseidon's son, extending the maritime theme into the outer solar reaches of our solar system. In oceanography and marine biology, Poseidon's influence appears in nomenclature. Various sea creatures have been given scientific or common names that reference the god. The Posidonia oceanica, a species of seagrass that forms extensive underwater meadows in the Mediterranean, was named to honor the god of the sea. Research vessels and underwater exploration equipment often bear names derived from Poseidon and related maritime mythology. The symbol of the trident itself has taken on meanings independent of Poseidon, while still carrying echoes of its origin. In heraldry, the trident represents maritime dominance and naval power. National flags and military insignia incorporate trident imagery. The trident has become a symbol of sovereignty over the seas, used by nations asserting territorial waters or maritime rights. When Ukraine sought a post-Soviet national symbol, they adopted a stylized trident that, while having medieval Slavic origins, also resonates with classical associations of power and independence. In popular culture, the trident has become associated with merfolk and undersea kingdoms more generally, appearing in everything from The Little Mermaid to Aquaman. These modern interpretations often simplify or alter the classical mythology, but they preserve the basic idea that the trident represents authority over the ocean and its inhabitants. King Triton in Disney's adaptation and Aquaman in DC Comics both wield tridents that grant them power over the seas, directly inheriting this attribute from Poseidon. The psychological and symbolic dimensions of Poseidon continue to fascinate scholars and artists. Carl Jung and other depth psychologists saw in Poseidon an archetype of the unconscious mind, particularly its turbulent emotional aspects. The sea, with its depths and hidden creatures, has long served as a metaphor for the unconscious, for those parts of the psyche that lie beneath the surface of conscious awareness. Poseidon, as ruler of those depths, represents the powerful forces within us that can emerge suddenly and overwhelmingly, like tidal waves or storms. Modern environmental movements have sometimes invoked Poseidon metaphorically when discussing ocean conservation. The god who once required sacrifices now serves as a reminder that the sea demands respect, that human activity has consequences, that we ignore the ocean's health at our peril. While this usage is metaphorical rather than religious, It echoes the ancient understanding that humanity exists in relationship with natural forces that are both essential and potentially destructive. Climate change and rising sea levels have given Poseidon's imagery new relevance. Artists and activists warning about coastal flooding and island nations threatened by rising oceans sometimes invoke the sea god as a personification of the ocean's power to reclaim land. These modern concerns would have resonated with ancient Greeks who built temples on headlands, who knew that the sea could suddenly surge inland, who understood that human communities existed on the ocean's sufferance. The endurance of Poseidon in human culture speaks to something fundamental about our relationship with the sea. For most of human history, the ocean was the largest, most powerful force that ordinary people encountered regularly. It provided food, but could also bring death. It enabled travel and trade, but could swallow ships without trace. It was beautiful and terrifying, nurturing and destructive, necessary and dangerous. Poseidon embodied all of these contradictions. Modern technology has given us tools the ancient Greeks never dreamed of. We have ships that can weather storms that would have destroyed any ancient vessel. We have sonar to map the seafloor and satellites to track hurricanes. We have scientific understanding of tides, currents, and marine ecosystems. We have, in many ways, tamed the sea that Poseidon once ruled absolutely. And yet the ocean remains mysterious and powerful. It covers most of our planet's surface, and we have explored only a fraction of its depths. It contains creatures strange beyond imagining, from giant squids to bioluminescent fish to microorganisms that may hold secrets about the origin of life itself. It drives our weather systems and regulates our climate. It feeds billions of people, but can also unleash tsunamis that kill hundreds of thousands in hours. We have not conquered the sea, we have merely learned to navigate it more safely, and even that safety is never absolute. Perhaps this is why Poseidon endures. He represents something that remains true regardless of technological advancement. Nature is powerful, and our relationship with it requires humility, respect, and recognition of our limitations. The ancient Greeks who sacrificed bulls to Poseidon before voyages understood this. Modern sailors, even with GPS and weather radar, still respect the sea's power. The names have changed, but the fundamental reality remains the same. Poseidon also represents the untamed aspects of existence, those parts of life that resist complete control or prediction. Despite all our planning and preparation, unexpected events still occur. Forces beyond our control still shape our lives. The earthquake that strikes without warning, the storm that appears suddenly, the accident at sea, all of these echo Poseidon's ancient unpredictability. We live in a world that is never entirely safe, never completely knowable, and Poseidon reminds us of that truth. In art, Poseidon continues to inspire. Sculptors create new interpretations of the god, from traditional representations to abstract explorations of what he means. Painters depict him emerging from waves or commanding his underwater realm. Photographers capture images of the sea in its many moods and see in them something of the god's temperament. Musicians compose pieces evoking the ocean's power and mystery, sometimes explicitly referencing Poseidon, sometimes allowing the connection to remain implicit. The god has also found his way into unexpected places. Poseidon appears in memes and internet humor, often in contexts that would have bewildered ancient Greeks. These playful appropriations demonstrate how mythological figures become part of the collective vocabulary, references that people can manipulate and reinterpret. While some classicists lament the trivialization of ancient religion, this process of cultural transmission and transformation is how myths have always survived. Every generation makes the old stories new, finding in them reflections of contemporary concerns. Educational institutions teaching Greek mythology always include substantial discussions of Poseidon. He is too important to the ancient Greek worldview to be neglected, too embedded in the surviving literature to be skipped over. Students learning about ancient Greece encounter him in the Iliad, the Odyssey, the plays of Euripides and Sophocles, and countless other texts. Through these educational encounters, new generations learn not just the facts about Poseidon, but something about how ancient people understood their world and their place in it. Museums around the world display artifacts related to Poseidon, statues and reliefs showing the god, coins bearing his image, pottery depicting his myths, dedicatory inscriptions from his temples. The British Museum, the Louvre, the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, and countless others preserve physical remnants of Poseidon's worship. These objects connect us directly to the people who once believed in him, who prayed to him, who feared and honored him. Standing before a marble statue of Poseidon from the 5th century BCE, we can almost feel the devotion and awe that inspired its creation. Archaeological work continues to uncover new information about Poseidon's worship. Recent excavations at various sites have revealed temple foundations, offering deposits and inscriptions that add to our understanding of how he was honored. The rediscovery of ancient Helice, the city that sank beneath the waves, has provided particularly valuable insights into Poseidon worship in the classical period. Each new find enriches our picture of the god and his significance in ancient life. The academic study of Poseidon has evolved significantly over time. Early scholars approached Greek mythology primarily through literary texts, analyzing myths as stories. Later generations brought anthropological, archaeological, and comparative religious approaches, examining worship practices, ritual objects, and how Greek religion compared to other ancient systems. Contemporary scholars use increasingly sophisticated methods, combining multiple disciplines to understand Poseidon not just as a mythological character, but as a central element in an entire civilization's way of understanding and navigating existence. What emerges from all this scholarship is a picture of remarkable complexity. Poseidon was not a simple or one-dimensional figure. He was a god of the sea, but also of earthquakes, fresh water, horses, and more. He was powerful, but not omnipotent, respected, but not always obeyed, feared, but also honored with gratitude. He embodied contradictions because the forces he represented were themselves contradictory. The sea that feeds us can drown us. The water that gives life can destroy through flood. The horse that carries us can throw us. These paradoxes were at the heart of Poseidon's nature. As we look to the future, Poseidon will undoubtedly continue to appear in human culture. New stories will be written featuring him. Artists will create new interpretations. Scholars will develop new understandings of his historical worship and significance. Perhaps most importantly, as long as humans continue to interact with the ocean, as long as we build ships and fish from the sea and fear storms and respect the water's power, some echo of Poseidon will remain in our consciousness. The god has evolved from object of worship to literary character to cultural symbol, but the core remains. Poseidon represents our relationship with powerful natural forces, our attempts to understand and negotiate with what we cannot fully control, our recognition that we are part of a larger world that does not exist solely for our benefit. These themes are as relevant now as they were 3,000 years ago when Mycenaean scribes first wrote his name on clay tablets. In the end, Poseidon endures because the sea endures. As long as waves crash against shores, as long as storms rise from calm waters, as long as the ocean's depths remain mysterious and the earthquake's cause uncertain, there will be some place in human consciousness for the god who embodies these forces. He may no longer receive sacrifices or prayers, but he has not disappeared. He has simply transformed, finding new ways to remain present in the stories we tell and the symbols we use to make sense of our world. The temples are ruins now, and the last priest who truly believed died centuries ago. But on stormy nights when waves tower and ships struggle and the earth occasionally trembles, it's easy to imagine the bearded god with his trident, stirring the waters as he has always done, reminding us that for all our achievements, nature remains powerful and the sea does not forget. The story of Poseidon is the story of humanity's relationship with forces larger than itself. From the ancient Greeks who sacrificed bulls on windswept headlands to modern sailors navigating by satellite, from poets invoking the god's name to scientists naming planets after him, Poseidon has remained a constant presence, a symbol of the sea's power and mystery. He was never the king of the gods, never the most powerful, always second to his brother Zeus. But perhaps that made him more interesting, more complex, more human in his resentments and ambitions. He fought for recognition, competed for cities, pursued vengeance against those who slighted him. He created wonders like horses and protected his children fiercely, even the monstrous ones. He could be generous and terrible, calm and stormy, nurturing and destructive. The ancient Greeks, in their wisdom, understood that such contradictions were not flaws but essential truths about the world. Life itself was contradictory. The forces that sustained existence could also destroy it. To honor Poseidon was to acknowledge this reality, to approach the sea with both gratitude and respect, to recognize that humanity existed in dialogue with powers beyond its control. That dialogue continues today, though in different forms. We may not sacrifice bulls, but we still respect the ocean's power. We may not pray to Poseidon before voyages, but we still prepare carefully and watch the weather with concern. We may not believe the god causes earthquakes, but we still build to withstand them and fear their unpredictable arrival. The relationship persists even as the explanation changes. Poseidon's legacy is all around us. In the symbols we use, the stories we tell, the names we give to ships and planets and scientific discoveries, in our enduring fascination with the ocean and its mysteries, in our recognition that nature, for all our technology and knowledge, remains powerful and sometimes dangerous, in our understanding that respect for forces beyond our control is not primitive superstition, but practical wisdom. So remember the Earthshaker, Lord of the Seas, creator of horses, father of heroes and monsters. Remember his temples on storm-swept capes and his games at the Isthmus. Remember his pursuit of Odysseus across a decade of waters and his help to those who honored him properly. Remember his trident striking rock to bring forth springs, his chariot racing across the waves, his voice like thunder across the deep. The gods may have left Olympus, but their stories remain, and in those stories we find not just entertainment or historical curiosity, but reflections of eternal truths about existence, about power, about the relationship between humanity and the vast forces that shape our world. Poseidon, god of the sea, storms, horses, and earthquakes, lives on in those stories and in the crashing waves that will echo long after all human voices have fallen silent. If you enjoyed this journey into Greek mythology, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more myths to explore, many more gods and heroes whose stories deserve to be told. Until next time, may your seas be calm and your foundations steady. Good night.